Welcome to Lecture 14 of Ancient Philosophy. Today we turn to Aristotle. We're going to be talking about Aristotle's views on nature. So let's begin with a general introduction to Aristotle and then jump right into his really fascinating collection of lecture notes on nature. So Aristotle is the most famous student of Plato. Aristotle was born in a town that is in the northeast of modern-day Greece, on the north part of the Aegean Sea, close to where modern-day Turkey is. So the town that he was born in, Stagira, is 40 miles east of modern Thessaloniki. At age 18, Aristotle joined Plato's academy, and he stayed there for almost 20 years as a student and then eventually as an instructor and as an independent researcher. Then he took a period where he left the academy and traveled around northern Greece and the northern Aegean Sea, most likely went over to where modern-day Turkey is. And for 3 of those years, he tutored the boy who would become Alexander the Great. In 335 BC, Aristotle returned to Athens to found a rival school known as the Lyceum. It was a rival to Plato's academy. And he taught at the Lyceum for 12 years until the death of Alexander the Great, and then the political events there forced Aristotle to leave Athens. He was 60 years old at that time, and he died a year later. Now, Aristotle did publish a number of works. He wrote dialogues, which evidently were exquisite in their beauty. Unfortunately, we do not have these dialogues anymore. This is very unfortunate. Perhaps one day, perhaps they may be discovered, but given that the ancient library of Alexandria burned to the ground and we lost many manuscripts in that fire, it's doubtful that we'll be able to find any of these dialogues. The works we do have from Aristotle are his lecture notes. These are not engaging to read. One of the frustrations that a lot of people have with reading Aristotle is that his view is spread out in a number of places. And what we need to keep in mind as we're reading Aristotle and talking about Aristotle, that these were just notes. I mean, these were intended for him to expand upon in lecture. One thing to note about the numbering, so we saw that with Plato we have the Stephanos numbering, which scholars use to refer to. With Aristotle we have what's known as Becker numbering. You can look this up on Wikipedia and read all about it. But for example, in the physics, what you'll see off to the side is you'll see a series of numbers. So for example, 199A3. 199 refers to the pagination in the Becker number. A and B are going to refer to whether it's on the left or right column, and then number 3 is the line number. So this is a very convenient way to refer to the works of Aristotle, and in your papers I want you to refer to particular passages by way of the Becker numbering. And we'll see how this goes as we turn to talk more about Aristotle and his views. So our primary text for studying Aristotle is going to be the Physics. I will refer to other texts throughout. Some of these you can go check out. All of Aristotle's works are available online. And some of the texts I'll send you small PDFs of the specific sections. So when we talk about Aristotle's Ethics, I'll send you some small sections from the Nicomachean Ethics, for example. Our reading for this section is Physics Book 2, chapters 1 through 3, and chapters 7 through 8, and then Book 3, chapters 1 through 3, and then we're going to end that off by reading Book 2, chapter 9. Now there is a method to this madness. This is a more topical presentation of the reading, so I would encourage you to read them in that direction. So Book 2 begins with the claim that everything that exists either exists by nature or by another cause. So a few things to note here. The word physics that we get for the title of Aristotle's Physics is physis in Greek, and physis is the word for nature. So another title for Aristotle's Physics is Aristotle on Nature. The general subject, as we'll see here, is trying to understand what Aristotle's view of nature is, and we'll see he has a really interesting view of what it is to understand a natural object. Another note about this idea that everything that exists either exists by nature or by another cause is that there's a very distinct notion of cause in Aristotle. And in fact, what we'll see in a bit is that we have a particular notion of cause which can make it difficult to even understand what Aristotle is after here. So in general, when Aristotle talks about cause, he's interested in explaining something. So he's interested in what might be called the ground of a thing, the why of it, the essence of it. We'll see how this works out in a bit. So let's continue on. So he says each natural one contains within itself a source of change and rest. So he identifies natural objects in contrast to artifacts, as natural objects have within themselves a source of change. So if we start, for example, with just an artifact and we think about that. For example, consider a pile of wood and suppose that we want to build a house. Well, there's nothing in the wood that has a principle of self-organization so that it will come together to build a house. We need a builder that will take the wood and make a house. So in the case of artifacts, we see that they have an external principle of change. There's the builder that takes the material and shapes it. Or, for example, we can consider a bronze statue. So we have here a picture of a bronze statue from the Roman Empire in the period of Augustus. So you start off with bronze that is then shaped and sculpted into a statue. There's nothing in the actual material, the bronze itself, that will develop into the statue of this young man. In contrast, when we consider natural objects, so consider, for example, a young child, the young child will develop into an adult male. That process of development isn't something that needs to be added by a builder or a sculptor in some sense. The child, given normal development, given food and hydration, will develop into a young man. There's a principle, there's a source of change within itself. We can see this in other animals. Aristotle thinks that the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water, the most basic constituents of the world, have within themselves a source of change, that fire is gradually changing to go upwards. So what we want to do is try to understand what this internal principle of change is within natural objects. Aristotle thinks that the form is directly present in the object, but it's not a material property. You can't locate the form, for example, by a microscope. Of course, Aristotle didn't have a microscope, but if he did, he would think that you can't see the form. The form is, in a way, a basic feature of the world. The form is a developmental force within an object that compels it to maturity. So if Aristotle, for example, was explaining why it is that a fertilized egg will develop into an embryo, which will then develop into a baby, which will then develop into a young child, which will then develop into an adult human being, Aristotle is going to appeal to the form that is immanent within that material structure. The form is the force that is guiding it to its end, to its telos, its goal. Now, since the 17th century, science has thought that forms emerge from matter, that forms are not these non-observable properties, but rather forms are a kind of structure that's inherent in matter and that explains why matter develops in the way that it does. For Aristotle, as we'll see in a bit, this picture doesn't make sense. Aristotle thinks that, in a way, material, basic material, is unable to develop any kinds of structures on its own. In order to have development, you need to have a principle of change. You need to have a force that is immanent in the matter, though not observable as such. So for Aristotle, in contrast to later science from the 17th century and onwards, objects are a combination of form and matter. For us moderns, since the 17th century, objects are purely material, and the forms that develop out of objects can be explicated in terms of properties of the matter. So Aristotle thinks that the goal of human knowledge is to understand the why of a thing. So he says in this passage in the physics that knowing requires understanding the why. To understand the why of a thing, you have to grasp the inner principle of change, the form. So in this section in Book 2, Chapter 3, Aristotle lays out 4 ways in which the word cause is used. Now remember, we noted that cause here is used in terms of a wider sense of explanation or ground of a thing. And we will flag in a bit the difference between the way Aristotle is using cause and our modern notion of efficient causation. The discussion of Aristotle's causes is often put in terms of 4 kinds of cause. So you get the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. And I have up there a picture illustrating this, which we'll talk about. That is a little confusing. Really, what's going on is we have 4 ways in which cause is used. There are 2 principal causes, if you will. there is matter and form, and then there are three aspects to form. So it's best to think about Aristotle's discussion of causes in terms of he's isolating matter and form, and then he's giving three ways to think about the form of a thing. So let's start off with matter. So when we're considering, for example, a table, we can talk about what it is made of. And this gets at the material aspects of the table. That is the wood. The wood is what makes it up. We can also talk about the way the table is made. And here we're talking about the principal source of change that takes the wood and crafts it into a table. Now this principal source of change is the carpenter that crafts the wood into a table. We can also talk about the goal or the end. What is the table for? And the table is for, suppose, dining, eating on. In addition to citing the principal source of change and the goal or the telos of the table, we can talk in general about its pattern or its form. And this is its structure. We can think of the table, in this example, a circular table with three legs. That would be its form. Now, Aristotle thinks that forms are inherent in objects in nature, and that we can grasp these forms. It's an assumption for his view that nature is intelligible, that we can understand nature by grasping the forms and objects that are inherent in the objects. In order to do this, we require careful observation over a long period so that we can look back and see how objects have developed in order to figure out what the form is. Now I want to note the difference between Aristotle's notion of cause and the way we think about efficient causation. So there's a philosopher in the 18th century, David Hume, who gave a criticism of the notion of cause. So Hume was operating with a purely empiricist view and thought that every idea that was in the mind had to come from some particular sense experience or from some logical arrangement of sense experiences. And so when he took as an example of causation one billiard ball striking another billiard ball. And for Hume, there was the event of one billiard ball moving along the table and then hitting another stationary billiard ball, and then that billiard ball moving in the opposite direction. And so Hume asked, he said, okay, let's try to analyze our notion of cause and see if we can find the idea that there's some kind of necessary connection between two events. And Hume thought that, look as closely as you will, what you'll see movement or change, and then you'll see contiguity. You'll see the two balls together, and then you'll see subsequent movement. Nowhere in that sequence of perceivable events, Hume thinks, do you see a necessary connection, that one thing happened because of another thing, or that one thing had to happen given another thing. So Hume there gives a picture of causation that's focused on events and the conclusion that we never observe the had to or the consequence between two events. So to take another example, consider pressure on the skin. And you can feel pressure on your skin. And you might think this is a great example of an intuitive notion of a causal relation, that one thing leads to another thing. Given that I take my finger and I press it on my hand, it had to be the case that I feel pressure on my hand, in some sense of had to. Well, as Hume is thinking about it, you never perceive the had to. You just see movement, contiguity, and then a subsequent change. You never see that the touching results in pressure on your hand. Now for Aristotle, he has a completely different view. He thinks that we can observe a source of change. He thinks that in the case of table making, you can see the carpenter making the table. Okay, so I hope that gives you a little bit of background on trying to understand Aristotle's notion of causation and how it fits with a modern notion of causation. I think the vast majority of people have an intuitive idea of causation very similar to the way Aristotle is operating, at least with respect to what we would call efficient cause or observing the source of change, is that most people think, of course, we can observe the principal source of change with a table coming into existence or with a house being built. Okay, so let's continue to talk about the notion of forms. So Aristotle introduces a distinction between actuality and potentiality. We can think of a form as being actualized in the mature state of an object. So if you think about an adult male, the relevant form exists in the adult male completely actualized. But if you think of a young child that is developing into an adult male, the form exists in a potential state where it's striving, it's actively becoming actualized. So this distinction between actuality and potentiality is crucial for Aristotle. These are two different states of forms. And the form exists as a potentiality in the object. It's a basic ontological feature of the world that the form exists as a striving, as a source of change toward the telos, the goal, the end of the object. We can compare Aristotle's view here with how we think of DNA and genetic structure as explaining phenotype in a person. So if we wanted to explain, for example, why a young child develops into an adult male, we would talk about their genetic structure. Now, their genetic structure is something that's within them that can be observed by, for example, an electron microscope. Now, for Aristotle, remember, the form is not in the material object. Aristotle has a conception of matter that it's unstructured. It doesn't have structure, and the structure at the lower level isn't going to be able to explain the structure at the higher level in any case. Right? So for Aristotle, there's the matter, and then there's the principle of change that's added to that. You can almost think about this as a Newtonian force. So the gravitational force is a principle of attraction between two objects. You can have the objects themselves, and then we can think of varying the force of attraction between them, and it's a primitive fact of the world on Newtonian science that the force of attraction between two objects is measured by the inverse square law multiplied by a gravitational constant. Okay, so hopefully that helps to understand, how form is functioning in Aristotle's account. So it's also a challenge to Aristotle's account that structure might come up spontaneously. So let's look at this passage on 198b16 and following. So Aristotle is talking about an objection to his account. So Aristotle says, what's wrong with the idea that nature does not act purposively and does not do things because they are better? The proper analogy might be that Zeus does not send rain so that the crops will grow. It's just a matter of necessity. Here Aristotle is thinking that whether or not it rains is a natural process. It's not something that Zeus, for example, would interfere with. The vapor drawn up from the earth is bound to cool down. Once it is cooled down, it is bound to turn to rain and fall back to the earth. And it is sheer coincidence that crops grow when this happens. So Aristotle is here observing that crops are growing, and that's correlated with rainfall. It's not because he's thinking that Zeus wants the crops to grow. He's thinking that there's a natural process underlying this. Water vaporizes, it cools, and then falls back to the earth. He continues, by the same token, if someone's grain is ruined on the threshing floor, this does not mean that the rain fell for the purpose of ruining the grain. It's just a coincidence. So what's wrong with the idea that the parts of natural things are like that too? Take teeth, for instance. What's wrong with the idea that the front teeth necessarily come through sharp and suitable for biting, and the back teeth flat and good for crushing food? Why should there be purpose behind this? Why should it not just be an accident? And the same question could be asked about any other part of the body which seems to have some purpose. So where every part turned out to be just as it would have been if it had some purpose, the creatures survived because spontaneously they happened to be put together in a useful way. So Aristotle here comes really close to objecting to his account by something that looks a lot like what we'll get many centuries later in Darwin's theory of evolution. And so we want to understand why Aristotle rejects this idea that structured events, regular events, could come about by chance. So here's how I see Aristotle reasoning. So Aristotle thinks that things that occur either by chance or for an end. Where if they occur for an end, there's a form underlying them. There's a principle of change that's intelligible that by study of the empirical world we can grasp. Then he reasons that natural things can't occur by chance, And so from those premises, from premise 1 and premise 2, you get the conclusion that natural things occur for an end. Now that argument is formally valid. If things occur either by chance or for an end, and natural things can't occur by chance, then natural things must occur for an end. So the crucial question here is, why does Aristotle think that premise 2 is true? Aristotle holds that natural things, for example like teeth, come about regularly in a certain way. They have a certain structure to them. That is true. Natural objects do have a certain structure to them. And then Aristotle thinks that regularities require structure. That seems reasonable to believe. If things happen on a regular basis that's repeatable over and over again, you want something that has structure that's going to explain that regularity. In the background, Aristotle is thinking that you're not going to get regularity from unstructured processes. So if you just think, if you have a collection of coins, for example, and you just throw them on the table, it's very unlikely that the coins will arrange themselves in a perfect circle. And moreover, it's even more improbable, almost to the point of where we would say it's a natural impossibility, that by continuing the process of throwing coins on the table, that they would arrange themselves in a perfect circle. We would need some sort of explanation for that in terms of the structure of the surface, or in terms of the process that is being deployed there. We would need some way to minimize the surprise that regular and routine throwing of coins onto a table would result in them forming a perfect circle. So the idea that regularities require structure is pretty plausible. So far Aristotle seems to be 2 for 2. Now the next idea that Aristotle has is that lower level structures can explain higher level structures. So let's illustrate this with the wooden house example that Aristotle uses. So Aristotle thinks that the wood that a house is made of isn't going to organize itself into a house. And if, almost completely improbable, if it managed to organize itself into, say, a simple A-frame house, there wouldn't be anything within the wood that would explain how that happened. That there's no structure in the lower level, the wood itself, that explains how the higher level structure, the house, came about. And so Aristotle is thinking that the material stuff that makes up natural objects doesn't have any structure in them that can generate higher level structures. And not just the empirical fact that they don't, but he has a more philosophical idea here, is that the lower level structures in a way can't explain the higher level structure. Okay, so this is the crucial point where Aristotle and Darwin disagree. That Darwin has posited a lower level structure that can generate the higher level structure. And the development of molecular genetics, for example, shows how this is possible. But Aristotle, of course, didn't know any of this. So the way Aristotle's thinking about it is that we have to have the form in the object in order to explain how lower level matter is able to develop into higher level structures. So the last aspect of Aristotle's view on matter and form that I want to highlight is the dependence between matter and form. So Aristotle thinks that certain bodies can't go with certain forms. Another way to say this is certain forms require certain kinds of bodies. So in parts of animals, so let's back up. So Aristotle, in addition to his philosophical investigations, did a lot of investigations of the natural world. Aristotle says in parts of animals, he says the fittest mode of treatment is to say that a man has such and such parts because the essence of man is such and such. So here Aristotle is explaining the matter, the material properties of persons in virtue of the form of a person. So this comes to the forefront in his discussion of the human hand. So let's look at this passage in Parts of Animals. So this is 687A9. If you want to look up Parts of Animals online, it is book 4 of Parts of Animals and in chapter 10. I'll read it from my copy. So he says, but it's more rational to suppose that man has hands because of his superior intelligence. So let's back up and let's read this entire passage. He writes, the reasons have now been stated why some animals have many feet, some only 2, others none. Why also some living things are plants and others are animals. And lastly, why man alone of all animals stands erect. Standing thus erect, man has no need of legs in front, and in their stead has been endowed by nature with arms and hands. Now it is the opinion of Anaxagoras that the possession of the hands is the cause of man being of all the animals most intelligent. So here Anaxagoras is thinking that why is a person intelligent? Why is man the most rational of all animals? And he's thinking, well, it's the hand that explains the reason that people are intelligent. So Aristotle here disagrees completely with Anaxagoras. Aristotle says, but it is more rational to suppose that man has hands because of his superior intelligence. That it's the form, the nature of a person that explains why they have matter structured such as the hand. For the hands are instruments, he continues, and the invariable plan of nature in distributing the organs is to give each to such animal as can make use of it, nature acting in this manner as any prudent man would do. For it is better to take a person who is already a flute player and give him a flute, than to take one who possesses a flute and teach him the art of flute playing. For nature adds that which is less to that which is greater and more important, and not that which is more valuable and greater to which is less. So Aristotle definitely has a certain teleology, a design in nature. It's important to realize here that this design isn't one of a master craftsman, a great creator, for example. Aristotle thinks that the teleology in nature is a matter of nature itself. It's forms that are immanent in nature, and this is intelligible. So Aristotle's view here is almost like a monotheistic view, but without God. That on a classical monotheistic conception, you think matter, the thought is that matter is in a way dumb, that matter has no structure to it that will organize itself into all the flora and fauna that we see. What's required is a divine craftsman that takes that matter and organizes it into plants and animals and human beings. Now for Aristotle, everything in that picture is about right, except for you don't need an intelligent agency crafting matter. He thinks that the agency is inherent in the forms themselves. So Aristotle's thoughts here on design, of course, are going to be picked up throughout the centuries, and people are going to use these. Aquinas, for example, to craft a argument for God's existence based upon facts of design. But we're not going to talk about that. We just want to understand Aristotle's view here. So let's look at another way that Aristotle uses his reasoning about forms and about nature to identify what the organs in a person are for. So let's talk about Aristotle's view of the human heart. So he says that the heart is the source of sensation. And I want to read this passage, 666a13 and following, in Parts of Animals. So he says here, moreover, the motions of pain and pleasure, and generally all sensation, plainly have their source in the heart, and find it in their termination. This, indeed, reason would lead us to expect. So he's giving an argument here that the heart is the source of all sensation. For the source must, whenever possible, be one. And of all places, the best suited for a source is the center. For the center is one, and is equally and almost equally within reach of every part. So Aristotle's thinking that sensation, here we have multiple different kinds of sensation. We have sensations in our feet, we have sensations in our hands, sensations, in our on our skull, and so on. And he thinks, well, where should the source of all sensation be? It should be in one place, and that place should be equidistant to all the various extremities of the body. And so he's led to think that, okay, well, then it needs to be in the center, and that's where the human heart is. So the human heart, right, is the source of sensation. Also in the background is an argument that the source of sensation is a single thing, is Aristotle's thinking that the senses are unified. It's not as if there are multiple centers of consciousness, a consciousness for example, touch, and a consciousness, for example, hearing. Rather, they're all unified in a single consciousness, and so it has to be a single organ. So you kind of see how Aristotle is reasoning about the physical world. I mean, it's an interesting argument. It almost works, but for the part that his principle that everything needs to be in the middle or equidistant, which just isn't true in the human body. You might think, well, what about the brain? What did he think about that? Well, he thought the brain was a source of cooling for the blood, And he reasoned on this based upon the fact that the brain's in the head, and the head isn't on the body anywhere. So it's a good place to dissipate heat. And this would be a natural place for blood to go to dissipate heat and then return to the body. So really interesting. I hope you're enjoying studying Aristotle. So we're going to talk about Aristotle on change next.